You may have noticed that the time period we're studying, namely 1815 to 1914, ends right as World War I begins. Well, sir, that assumes I know what any date means, and that is a large assumption. Fair enough, but I only mention it because everything we're going to talk about in this video is really setting the stage for that worldwide cataclysm, so that means we need to talk about the Crimean War, German and Italian unification, and the tensions in the Balkans. So if that's what you're studying, then this video is for you. Let's go get them brain cows milk. Okay, so let's begin with the Crimean War, which began in 1853. There's a lot to digest in this video, so if you want fill-in-the-blank note guys to follow along, check the link in the description. So prior to this war, remember that Europe enjoyed about 50 years of peace, depending on who you talk to, during the Concert of Europe. But the Crimean War would be a major conflict that would bring that peace to an end. It was a war that started over religious tension in the Ottoman Empire, which by this point had begun to decline as a major power in Europe. You see, the Ottoman Sultan, under pressure from Napoleon III in France, granted special privileges to Roman Catholics living in Jerusalem, and Russia wanted those same privileges extended to Orthodox Christians, but due to some bullying from France, they weren't. Additionally, there were political motives as well. Both France and Russia, though they were combatants in this war, had a similar desire, namely to weaken the Ottoman Empire, which was already growing weak because of various nationalist movements. Additionally, Russia wanted access to the Crimean Peninsula, which was a prime warm water port for shipping and receiving. So long story short, the war broke out. On one side was Russia, all by their lone. Now, Russia didn't want to fight alone, so they called up their ally Austria, who summarily declared neutrality and refused to help the Russian cause. On the other side of the war were the Ottomans, supported by Britain and France. Now, ultimately, Russia lost this war and was humiliated on the world stage. But it's the consequences of this war that are more important for our purposes. By breaking up and rearranging the relationships of power among various European states, the Crimean War effectively broke up the Concert of Europe, which had kept the peace and the balance of power since its inception. Second, Britain and Russia largely turned inward and withdrew from continental affairs after the war, and that absence created the conditions in which leaders in Germany and Italy can seek the unification of their states, and well, I reckon we ought to talk about that now. Now remember that during this period, Italy was a conglomeration of many different states, but there had been movements for the unification of those states for a long time, but none of them were successful. But what they really needed was a strong ruler from a strong state to push unification through, and spoiler alert, they got one. Let me introduce you to Count Cavour, who became prime minister of the Piedmont region of Italy in 1852, and it was the Piedmont region that the nationalists of the Italian peninsula looked to lead the way for unification of its various regions. Now, Cavour was a shrewd politician whose infrastructure programs in Piedmont generated the kind of wealth that allowed him to assemble a massive army. And that army helped him significantly, but Cavour still faced a couple of giant obstacles to the unifying of the Italian peninsula, and those obstacles were named Austria and France. You see, Austria and France controlled these regions right here, and if you've learned anything about European geopolitics by now, it's this. Ain't nobody want to give up what they control. So any plan of Italian unification would have to figure out how to wrest those regions from French and Austrian influence. So Cavour promised Napoleon III that if he helped him drive the Austrians out of northern Italy, then France could keep what they held on the Italian peninsula along with a couple other territories. Needless to say, it didn't really work out. You don't really need to know all the details, but you should know that Napoleon didn't do all that he said he would, and that enraged Cavour. But in the middle of his rage, something providential happened. The northern Italian regions had been taken over by nationalists, and they agreed to join Piedmont. So northern Italy is unified. Now what about southern Italy? And for that, let me introduce you to Giuseppe Garibaldi. While all of this was going on in the north, similar events were occurring in southern Italy under the military leadership of Garibaldi. He was a masterful military leader and led his men, called the Red Shirts, to unify the southern region. And after uniting the regions of southern Italy, he gave over sovereignty to the ruler of northern Italy, Victor Emmanuel II. And at this point, almost the entire Italian peninsula was unified, with the exception of Rome, which was still occupied by France. But thanks to that pesky Franco-Prussian War in 1870, Napoleon III withdrew his troops from central Italy to go fight elsewhere. And that's when Victor Emmanuel claimed the central region and Italian unification was complete. Okay, now let's turn the corner and look at the movement for German unification. Remember that during the Revolution of 1848, one of the desires of the revolutionaries was a unified Germany. But their revolution got stamped out, and that dream would have to wait. What they needed was a strong ruler from a strong state to lead the unification, and spoiler alert, they got it with the rise of Otto von Bismarck. Now, Bismarck was a master of what's known as realpolitik. This is a way of political maneuvering that sought practical results. In other words, instead of asking what is the right or moral thing to do in this situation, the practitioner of realpolitik asks, what is the best action for me to take in order to get what I want? It's a very Machiavellian way of looking at things. Now, Bismarck was the chancellor of Prussia, and Prussia was the most powerful German state at that time. And so Bismarck, like Cavour in Italy, introduced reforms aimed at increasing Prussia's wealth, most notably bulking up the Prussian army. And hey, if you got an army, you're gonna need some wars, and so there were three key wars that Bismarck used to unify Germany. First was the Prussian-Danish War of 1864. In the north, there were two German provinces controlled by Denmark. The people in these provinces were German and spoke German, and so Bismarck aimed to take back those territories and make them properly German. And in order to do this, he got Austria to agree to help in the cause, and they were almost immediately successful. And as a result, one province went to Prussia and the other went to Austria. But Bismarck had no interest in Austrian rule over German provinces. This was just a practical measure that led him to the next stage. Remember, realpolitik. The second war was the Austro-Prussian War, which began in 1866. Before this war broke out, Bismarck skillfully negotiated non-interference treaties with major European powers like Russia and Britain because he didn't want them joining the cause and messing with his plans. And so once that was settled, Bismarck provoked a little fighting between the two provinces that brought Prussia and Austria into the war. And what Bismarck thought is that if a regional struggle broke out, then the German states would be forced to choose sides between Prussia and Austria, and that is exactly what happened. Most of the northern German states supported Prussia and not Austria. And with those German states starting to line up behind Prussia, well baby, that's starting to smell like unification stew. But that stew isn't ready yet because the southern German provinces were still outside the fray. But Bismarck engineered a third war called the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and here behold the realpolitik master at work. Bismarck thought that the best way to unify the southern German states to the north was to fight a common enemy, and that would be France. But at that point, there was no reason to go to war. So if there's no reason to go to war, well, maybe don't go to war. Nah, man, this is Otto von Bismarck we're talking about. If there aren't legitimate reasons to go to war, so make some up. So what Bismarck did is falsify a document in which a Prussian diplomat insulted Napoleon III and then accidentally leaked it to France. And apparently Napoleon had an ego about as fragile as a fart in the wind, and so for that slight, he went ahead and declared war on Prussia. And it worked exactly how Bismarck had planned. All the German provinces rallied to Prussia's defense and defeated France handily. As a result, Kaiser Wilhelm I was crowned King of Germany and the unification was complete. Now, in 1871, Bismarck was appointed as the Chancellor of the United German State, and his main goal during that time was to strengthen Germany. And for our purposes in this video, one of the most significant things he did was to create alliances with other states. And he did this because he knew France was still saucy about their loss in the Franco-Prussian War, and Bismarck wanted to be sure that Germany stood strong against France should they seek to retaliate. The first alliance you should know about is the Three Emperors League, which included Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. The idea behind this partnership is that the three states would control Eastern Europe, especially the Balkans, which were becoming increasingly unstable, on which more in a moment. Once the Three Emperors League collapsed in 1887, a new alliance was formed between Russia and Germany called the Reinsurance Treaty. They promised each other that they would remain neutral if either got involved in a war, unless that war was Germany versus France or Russia versus Austria. And then, after relations deteriorated with Russia, Bismarck established the Triple Alliance, which included Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And I hope that sounds at least a little familiar because that's the alliance that will go to World War I. Anyway, the point of these alliances from Bismarck's point of view was to increasingly isolate France, who was Germany's chief rival. And it worked, and what you really need to remember by the time Bismarck was dismissed as Chancellor in 1890 is that Europe was a collection of mutually antagonistic alliances, which is going to make negotiation and flexibility between these two sides almost impossible. Now, as I mentioned before, while all this is going on, there's growing unrest in the Balkans, which was largely driven by a growing nationalist sentiment. Now, Bismarck saw this and organized the Congress of Berlin in 1878 in order to solve this problem. At the Congress were the major powers of Europe, and really their decisions didn't consider the nationalist desires for self-rule in the Balkans and only considered the balance of power between the great powers. And in doing so, the Congress only increased the tension in the Balkans. And to understand this, you really need to understand that this region was multi-ethnic, and as nationalist movements spread across Europe, these folks too wanted to unite under their own states and be free of Austrian or Russian or Ottoman rule. Needless to say, in two wars known as the First and Second Balkan Wars, the alliances that I mentioned in the last point lit up and had the great powers of Europe fighting on different sides of the Balkan Wars. And those battles cemented the divisions which would eventually lead to World War I. Alright, that was a lot, but you can click here to keep reviewing for Unit 7 of AP Euro. If you want help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right here and grab my AP Euro review pack, which will make all your dreams come true. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.